The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Michael Bagent and Richard Lay. Chapter 3. The Scandal of the Scrolls. Ironically enough, it was not a biblical scholar, not an expert in the field, but an outsider who first detected something suspect in the international team's position. The outsider was a distinguished American literary and cultural critic, Edmund Wilson, whom most university students in Britain and the States will have encountered through his work in fields far removed from Qumran and first-century Palestine. He is known for his own fiction, for I Thought of Daisy, and particularly memoirs of Hecate County. He is known as the author of Axel's Castle, an original and pioneering study of the influence of French symbolism on 20th century literature. He is known for, too, the Finland Station, an account of Lenin's machinations and the Bolshevik hijacking of the Russian Revolution. And he is known for the grotesque, highly publicized literary feud he precipitated with his former friend Vladimir Nabokov by presuming to challenge Nabokov's translation of Pushkin's Eugenie Onegin. As his controversy with Nabokov demonstrated, Wilson had no compunction about venturing into waters beyond his officially acknowledged expertise. But perhaps it was just such recklessness that Qumran research required, the perspective of an outsider, a man capable of establishing some kind of overview. In any case, Wilson, in 1955, wrote a lengthy article for The New Yorker on the Dead Sea Scrolls, an article which, for the first time, made the scrolls a household phrase and generated interest in them from the general public. In the same year, Wilson expanded his article and published it as a book, The Scrolls from the Dead Sea. 14 years later, in 1969, this text was expanded again to encompass new material and was reissued at virtually twice its former length. To this day, it remains one of the basic and most popular investigative works on the Qumran scrolls by an outsider. But even if Wilson was an outsider in the realm of biblical scholarship, he was certainly no mere amateur or dabbler. Not even DeVoe's international team could impugn his integrity or high seriousness. Wilson was thus able, on behalf of the literate public, to call them in some sense to account. As early as 1955, Wilson detected a desire on the part of the experts to distance the Qumran scrolls from both Judaism and Christianity. The experts, it seems to him, were protesting rather too vehemently, and this aroused his suspicions. As soon as one sets out to study the controversies provoked by the Dead Sea Scrolls, one becomes aware of a certain tension, but the tension does not arise from the at first much disputed problems of dating, and the contention about the dating itself had, perhaps, behind it other anxieties than the purely scholarly ones. Wilson stressed how much the scrolls had in common with both rabbinical Judaism, as it was emerging during the 1st century A.D., and with the earliest forms of Christianity, and he noted a marked inhibition on the part of both Judaic and Christian-oriented scholars to make the often obvious connections. One would like to see these problems discussed, and in the meantime one cannot but ask oneself whether the scholars who have been working on the scrolls, so many of whom have taken Christian orders or have been trained in the rabbinical tradition, may not have been somewhat inhibited in dealing with such questions as these by their various religious commitments, One feels a certain nervousness, a reluctance to take hold of the subject and to place it in its historical perspective. In accordance with scholarly decorum, Wilson is, of course, being tactful, couching a fairly serious charge in the most diplomatic of language. He himself had no compunction about taking hold of the subject and placing it in historical perspective. If in any case we look now at Jesus in the perspective supplied by the scrolls, we can trace a new continuity and at last get some sense of the drama that culminated in Christianity. The monastery of Qumran is perhaps more than Bethlehem or Nazareth, the cradle of Christianity. It is, alas, characteristic and typical of biblical scholarship, and particularly of scholarship associated with the scrolls, that such a connection should be made not by the experts in the field, but by an astute and informed observer. For it was Wilson who gave precise and succinct expression to the very issues the international team endeavored so diligently to avoid. These imputations about the bias of most biblical scholars were echoed to us personally by Philip Davies, professor of biblical studies at the University of Sheffield, and author of 2 books on the Qumran material. As Professor Davies pointed out, most scholars working with the scrolls were, and for that matter still are, Christian-oriented, with a background primarily in the New Testament. He knew a number, he said, whose research sometimes conflicted painfully with their most passionately held personal beliefs, and questioned whether objectivity in such cases was really possible. Professor Davies stressed the perennial confusion of theology with history. All too often, he said, the New Testament is taught not just as the former, but also as the latter, as a literal and accurate account of first-century events. And if one takes the New Testament, the Gospels, and the Acts of the Apostles as incontrovertible historical fact, it is impossible to do scholarly justice to the scrolls. Christian doctrine, in effect, dictates the agenda. Because Edmund Wilson was an outsider, the international team could get away with adopting towards him an attitude of patronizing condescension. He was too distinguished to be insulted or abused, but he could be ignored or dismissed superciliously as an intelligent and well-intentioned amateur who simply did not understand the complexities and subtleties of the issues involved, and who, in his alleged naivety, might make rash statements. It was thus that many scholars were intimidated against saying what they actually believed. Academic reputations are fragile things, and only the most audacious or severe individuals could afford to incur the risk involved. The risk of being discredited, of being isolated by a concerted critical barrage from adherents of the consensus. The scrolls are a fief, Shemery. Oh my God, what is that? Back up. The scrolls are a fief. Shemery Ahu Talman himself, a prominent Israel professor in the field, observed, and the scholars who monopolized them were, in effect, a cabal. Not even such cabals, however, can be omnipotent in oppressing dissident. Again. Not even such cabals, however, can be omnipotent in... Again. Not even such cabals, however, can be omnipotent in suppressing dissent. Edmund Wilson may have been an outsider, but deviation from the international team's consensus was beginning to surface with the cocoon sphere of biblical scholarship itself. As early as 1950, 5 years before Wilson's book, André de Pont-Sommer professor of Semitic language and civilization at the Sorbonne, had presented a public paper which caused a sensation. He addressed himself to one of the Qumran texts recently translated. It described, he explained to his audience, a self-styled sect of the New Covenant, whose leader, known as the Teacher of Righteousness, was held to be a Messiah, was persecuted, tortured, and martyred. The teacher's followers believed the end of the world to be imminent, and only those with faith in him would be saved. And albeit cautiously, de Pont-Sommer did not shrink from drawing the obvious conclusion that the Teacher of Righteousness was in many ways the exact prototype of Jesus. These assertions provoked a squall of controversy and protest. Jesus' uniqueness and originality were held to be under attack, and the Catholic establishment, especially in France and the States, began to unleash its critical artillery. Du Pont-Sommer himself was somewhat shaken by the reaction, and in subsequent statements sought shelter behind more circumspect phraseology. Anyone who might have been inclined to support him was also, for a time, obliged to duck for cover. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted and was eventually to bear fruit. From the standpoint of Christian theological tradition, that fruit was to be particularly poisonous when it burgeoned amidst the international team themselves in the very precincts of the Rockefeller Museum scrollery. Among the scholars of Father DeVoe's original international team, perhaps the most dynamic, original, and audacious was John Marco Allegro. Certainly he was the most spontaneous, the most independent-minded, the most resistant to suppression of material. Born in 1923, he saw service in the Royal Navy during the war, and in 1947, the year the first Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, entered Manchester University as an undergraduate studying logic, Greek, and Hebrew. A year later, he transferred to the honors course in Semitic studies. He also developed an interest in philology, the study of the origins of language, its underlying structure and development. Bringing his philological expertise to bear on biblical text, he quickly became convinced that Scripture could not be taken at face value, and proclaimed himself an agnostic. In June 1951, he graduated with a BA, first-class honors in Oriental Studies, and the following year received his MA for his thesis, a linguistic study of the Balaam oracles in the Book of Numbers. In October of that year, he enrolled in the doctoral program at Oxford under the supervision of the distinguished Semitic scholar, Professor Godfrey R. Driver. A year later, Driver recommended him for the international team then being assembled by DeVoe, and Allegro was assigned the crucial material found in Cave 4 at Qumran. He departed for Jerusalem in September 1953. By that time, he had already published 4 acclaimed articles in the academic journals, a track record more impressive than anyone else on the team could claim. In 1956, Allegro published a popular book. The Dead Sea Scrolls followed this in 1968, with his own research on the text and fragments from Cave 4. In the 5th volume of the definitive Oxford University Press series, Discoveries in the Judean Desert. At this point, Allegro was one of the most esteemed and prestigious figures in the field of biblical scholarship. Yet within 2 years, he was to abandon his colleagues on the international team, turn his back upon the academic world, and resign his university post at Manchester. He was also to be vilified and discredited. what had happened. It quickly became clear to the academic community in general, as well as to the international team, that Allegro was the only one among them who was not only an agnostic, but also uninhibited about rocking the boat. Unconstrained by the personal religious bias, he explained things, often impetuously, as he saw them, and he rapidly lost patience with his colleagues' refusal to countenance any theories, or even evidence that might contradict the accepted party line on Christian origins. In particular, he grew exasperated with the strained attempts to distance Christianity from the scrolls and the Qumran community. He insisted on the obvious connection between the two, and suggested that connection might be closer than anyone had hitherto believed, or at any rate dared to suppose. The first major storm occurred in 1956 when Allegro agreed to give a series of 3 short talks on the Dead Sea Scrolls to be transmitted on radio in the north of England on the 16th, 23rd, and 30th of January. It was clear that he intended to accelerate the tempo of scroll research by injecting an element of excitement and controversy. "I think we can look for fireworks," he wrote imprudently to John Strugnell, who was then in Jerusalem. That statement, as Allegro failed to appreciate, was bound to set alarm bells ringing in the Catholic-dominated scrollery. Oblivious to this, he went on to say that recent study of the fragments has convinced me that de Pont-Sommer is more right than he knew. At the time, apparently, Strugnell was considering a career in the church. Allegro quipped, "I shouldn't worry about that theological job if I were you. By the time I've finished, there won't be any church left for you to join." Allegro's first and second broadcast attracted little attention in Britain, but the second was written up by the New York Times, which misunderstood and misquoted him, yet generated a flurry of debate. The third talk, broadcast on the 30th of January, was followed on 5th of February by an article in the New York Times, which could not but cause a sensation. "Christian basis seen in scrolls," the headline proclaimed. "The origins of some Christian ritual and doctrines can be seen in the documents of an extremist Jewish sect that existed for more than 100 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. This is the interpretation placed on the fabulous collection of Dead Sea Scrolls by one of the international team of 7 scholars. John Allegro said last night in a broadcast that the historical basis of the Lord's Supper, and part at least of the Lord's Prayer and the New Testament teaching of Jesus, were attributable to the Qumranians." The same article hinted at trouble to come, quoting a Catholic scholar as saying that any stick now seems to be big enough to use against Christianity, provided it could be used to dislodge belief in the uniqueness of Jesus. Allegro, in fact, was beginning to trespass on very sensitive territory indeed. On the 6th of February, Time magazine ran an article entitled "Crucifixion Before Christ." 2 days later, the Times reported that 3 American religious leaders, 1 Jewish, 1 Catholic, and 1 Protestant, had joined forces to refute Allegro and warn against any attempt to depict the Essenes as precursors of Christianity. All this controversy was, of course, finding its way back to DeVoe, together with requests that something be done. Allegro, however, appears to have been almost naively insouciant. On the 9th of February, he wrote to DeVoe, claiming he was being accused of saying the most astonishing things, some of which are true. and are indeed astounding. Others come from the bosoms of eager reporters. It is clear in retrospect that Allegro never fully realized how sarcastic. Again. It is clear in retrospect that Allegro never fully realized how sacrosanct the idea of Jesus' uniqueness was, and that, as a result, he underestimated the lengths to which DeVoe and other members of the international team would go in order to distance themselves from the blunt approach. This was his only real mistake, so far, that of expecting his colleagues to accept his assertions without letting their own religious allegiances influence their judgment. In his own view, he was addressing his material as a disinterested scholar, and hoped they might eventually do likewise. His innocent jibe that by the time he'd finished there'd be no church left for Strugnell to join testifies to his conviction of how important and conclusive he felt this material to be, and to his excitement at the discovery. On the 11th of February, DeVoe wrote back to Allegro distinctly unamused. All the texts available to Allegro, DeVoe said, were also available to other members of the team in Jerusalem. They had failed to find anything that supported Allegro's interpretation. In his reply on the 20th of February, Allegro attempted to stand his ground and at the same time repair the rift with his colleagues and diffuse the public controversy. You will excuse me if I think that everyone in the world is going stark raving mad. I am enclosing my broadcast talks as your request, and if, after reading them, you are left wondering what all the fuss is about, you will be in precisely my position. Noting that Strugnell and Millock were alleged to be preparing rebuttals of his statements, he commented, I am not waging any war against the church, and if I were, you may rest assured I would not let any loopholes in. I stand by everything I said in my 3 talks, but I'm quite prepared to believe that there may be other interpretations of my readings. On March 4th, DeVoe replied, warning Allegro that a rebuttal was indeed being prepared. It would not be just from Strugnell and Millock, however. Neither would it be confined to a scholarly journal. On the contrary, it would take the form of a letter to the Times in London and would be signed by all the members of the international team. Instead of being intimidated, Allegro was defiant. Not mincing words, he responded that a letter to the Times should be most interesting to the London public, who have never heard my broadcasts. I have already pointed out to you that these broadcasts were made on the local northern station. You and your friends are now apparently going to draw the attention of the gutter press of this country to these passages, of which neither they nor the majority of their readers have heard, and start a witch hunt. I congratulate you. What will certainly happen is that the press, scenting trouble, will descend like hawks on me and want to know what it is all about. They will have added fuel in what appears on the face of it to be a controversy developing between the ecclesiastics of the scroll team and the one unattached member. He went on to invoke Edmund Wilson, indicating just how worried DeVoe's team should be by the suspicions Wilson had voiced. In effect, he was attempting to use Wilson as a deterrent. Having regard to what Wilson has already said about the unwillingness of the Church to tackle these texts objectively, you can imagine what will be made out of this rumpus. With all respect, I must point out to you that this nonsense of Wilson's has been taken seriously here. At every lecture on the scrolls I give, the same old question pops up. Is it true that the Church is scared? And can we be sure that everything will be published? That may sound silly to you and me, but it is a serious doubt in the minds of ordinary folk. I need hardly add what effect the signatures of 3 Roman priests on the bottom of this proposed letter will have.